I remember the exact temperature of the room the day I was completely erased from my own family. It was 68 degrees, a crisp, sterile, lifeless hospital room. It smelled of antiseptic, fresh linens, and the faint metallic scent of medical machinery. But to me, it will always smell like the exact moment my bloodline was hijacked. To understand the absolute zero of that moment, you have to understand the intense heat of the years that came before it. You have to understand what it means to build a life from absolute dirt. I was not born into wealth. I was not born into legacy, high society, or trust funds. I was born into the kind of deep, generational poverty that gets permanently wedged under your fingernails. The kind of poverty that makes you calculate the exact cost of breathing. The kind that wakes you up in a cold sweat at 3 in the morning. When my wife, Sarah, passed away from an aggressive illness 30 years ago, she left me with a crushing, suffocating mountain of medical debt and a terrified, quiet 4-year-old boy named David. I didn't have the luxury of grieving. I didn't have the time to sit in therapy or cry to my friends. I had a son to raise, and the world does not wait for a grieving man. For decades, I worked 3 back-breaking jobs. I wore heavy steel-toed boots that were falling apart at the seams, wrapped in duct tape to keep the winter snow out. I drove a battered pickup truck that sounded like it was coughing up its own engine every time I turned the key. I ate the cheapest food, wore the cheapest clothes, and sacrificed every single ounce of my own comfort so David would never feel the cold, unforgiving wind of poverty. I paid for his college in cash. I made sure he had every advantage, every opportunity, every single thing I was denied. But in my quiet hours, when David was asleep and the house was dead silent, I studied. I didn't watch television. I didn't socialize at the local bar. I read dense, complicated financial reports by the light of a single flickering bulb. I learned about municipal zoning laws, urban expansion plans, and the silent, terrifyingly mathematical power of compound interest. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar, saving pennies over decades, I started buying acres of barren, forgotten land on the extreme outskirts of the city. Everyone thought I was a fool, a dirty-booted, uneducated old man throwing his hard-earned money at useless dirt in the middle of nowhere. They didn't know the city was planning to build a massive commercial highway right through that useless dirt 20 years later. I knew. I had spent years in the public library reading the tedious 100-page public proposals that no one else bothered to look at. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my head down, and I practiced the one skill poor men are forced to master, waiting. Which brings me back to that 68-degree hospital room. I was holding a small blue teddy bear. I had spent 2 hours at the store picking it out, agonizing over which one was soft enough for a newborn, which one looked the most comforting. My rough, calloused hands were shaking, not from age, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming, terrifying realization that I was finally a grandfather. Little Leo was sleeping quietly in the clear plastic bassinet. He looked so much like my late wife, Sarah, that it made my chest physically ache. I took a step forward to look at him. Just one single step. That was when Eleanor, my daughter-in-law, stepped directly into my path. She put her hand flat on my chest and pushed me back. "Don't touch him," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was dripping with a kind of absolute, aristocratic disgust that cut deeper and colder than any shout. It was the tone of a master speaking to a stray dog that had wandered into the dining room. I looked at my son, David, my boy, the boy I had broken my back for, the boy I had starved for. He was standing in the corner of the room, looking intensely at the linoleum floor. He didn't say a word. He didn't even shift his weight. He just let his wife stand between me and the only grandson I would ever have. "Eleanor," I whispered, genuinely confused, my mind struggling to process the sudden hostility. "I just want to see his face. Just for a second. I brought him this." She didn't look at the bear. She turned to fully face me, crossing her arms over her expensive, perfectly tailored silk blouse. "Arthur, let's be brutally honest," she sneered. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, dissecting my worn flannel shirt, my rough hands, and my work boots with surgical precision. "You live in a decaying house. You wear boots covered in dirt. You have no connections, no real money, and absolutely nothing of value to pass down. We are raising Leo to be successful.
We are building a high society network for him. You are just not good enough for him. I don't want your mediocrity rubbing off on my son." I didn't react immediately. I waited for David to intervene. I waited for my son to step forward, to look at his wife and say, "This is my father, the man who sacrificed everything for me." I waited.
The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing, heavy, and deeply humiliating. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to the bed. Finally, David cleared his throat. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at the wall directly above my head. "Dad, maybe you should go," he mumbled, his voice weak and pathetic. She's just stressed from the delivery. Let's not do this right now. Please, just leave." I looked at the blue teddy bear in my hands. Its soft fur felt like sandpaper against my skin. Then I looked at Eleanor's triumphant, arrogant smile. She had tested her absolute control over my son, and she had won. She had established her total dominance in front of me. Most men would have yelled. Most men would have caused a spectacular scene, demanding their rights as a grandfather, screaming about respect and family and blood. They would have thrown a massive tantrum, validating Eleanor's belief that I was nothing but an uncultured, emotional brute. They would have given her the exact ammunition she needed to play the victim. I didn't. I didn't say a single word of protest. I gently, carefully placed the blue bear on a small vinyl chair by the door. I looked at Leo one last time, memorizing the shape of his tiny hands, promising him silently that this was not the end. "Understood," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, and I walked out of the hospital into the freezing rain, and I drove home in silence. I didn't call them the next day. I didn't call them the next week. I didn't call them on Leo's first birthday, or his second, or his fifth. I became a ghost. Eleanor wanted me gone because she thought I was a poor, useless old man who would drag her high society ambitions down. She wanted a clean break so she could rewrite David's history. I gave her exactly what she asked for. But I did not sit idle in the dark. What Eleanor didn't know, what even my own son didn't know, was that the decaying house I lived in sat squarely on 70 acres of prime commercial zoning land that the city was now absolutely desperate to acquire for their new infrastructure project. 6 months after that day in the hospital, the city's commercial developers finalized their offers. They tried to lowball me at first, assuming the old man in the flannel shirt didn't understand the market. But I had spent 20 years reading the market. I countered their offer, dismantled their arguments with pure zoning law facts, and forced them to the table on my terms. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom overlooking the downtown skyline, still wearing my flannel shirt. And I signed a contract that transferred those 70 acres to a commercial syndicate. I sold the land for a sum that would make Eleanor faint. We are not talking about comfortable retirement money. We are talking about generational wealth. We are talking about the kind of money that alters landscapes. The kind of money that buys absolute, unquestionable, terrifying power. I didn't buy a sports car. I didn't buy gold watches. I moved 2 states away. I purchased a massive, gated estate nestled in a private valley, surrounded by ancient oak trees and a security perimeter that would rival a military compound. The main house was a masterpiece of stone and dark wood. I hired a small, fiercely loyal, and highly discreet staff, a housekeeper named Maria, a groundskeeper, and a private chef. I built a life of immense, quiet privilege. My days were intensely peaceful. I read philosophy in the mornings. I expanded my investment portfolio in the afternoons, turning millions into tens of millions through aggressive, calculated market maneuvers. I built a massive library out of dark mahogany, filling it with first editions. I drank scotch that was older than my son. But I never forgot. Not for a single day. I never checked their social media. I didn't need to look at filtered photos of their fake lives. Instead, I retained one of the most ruthless and efficient private legal firms in the country. Twice a year, a man named Mr. Pruitt, a senior partner whose suits cost more than most cars, would drive up my private road, sit in my study, and hand me a highly detailed dossier on David and Eleanor's financial standing. I watched their lives unfold on paper. I tracked their spending, their loans, their business ventures. I respected the physical boundary Eleanor drew, but I studied the enemy with the patience and precision of an apex predator. For the first 5 years, they lived exactly as Eleanor demanded. High society, illusion, smoke and mirrors. David had launched a tech startup funded entirely by predatory venture capital loans. He was playing the role of the visionary CEO. Eleanor threw lavish dinner parties, bought luxury European vehicles on lease, and dressed little Leo in designer clothes for exclusive country club photos. They were performing wealth, playing a dangerous, exhausting game of appearances to impress people who didn't actually care about them. But a castle built on sand cannot withstand the tide, and the tide always, eventually, comes in. By year 6, David's tech startup failed to deliver its flagship software. He lacked the discipline to manage the engineers, and the investors pulled out. The loans defaulted. The company was quietly liquidated. The facade began to crack. By year 7, Eleanor flatly refused to downgrade her lifestyle. She couldn't bear the thought of her country club friends knowing they were failing. She was a textbook narcissist, and to a narcissist, image is oxygen. To admit defeat meant admitting she wasn't superior. She began maxing out credit cards just to maintain the illusion. She took out secret secondary loans with astronomical interest rates to pay for the country club memberships and the designer bags. She pushed them deeper and deeper into a suffocating, inescapable abyss of debt. I knew everything. Mr. Pruitt's dossiers grew thicker. I knew about the foreclosed house notices they hid from their friends. I knew about the repo men taking the luxury SUVs in the dead of night, forcing them to rent cheap cars under fake names. I knew about the private school tuition they could no longer afford for Leo, the warning letters from the headmaster sitting unopened on their kitchen counter. I watched the numbers in Mr. Pruitt's folders turn from a manageable black to a violently bleeding red. They were drowning. Their lungs were filling with water, and I sat in my leather chair in my mahogany library, perfectly dry, drinking my scotch and waiting. I thought I would never actually see them again. I thought they would just fade into bankruptcy, move to a tiny apartment in a different city, and disappear into a smaller, quieter life of regret. until a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 8 years and 2 months after I left that hospital room. A massive, violent storm had rolled into the valley. Thunder shook the heavy bulletproof glass windows of my study. I was reading a book by the roaring fireplace when the security intercom on my desk suddenly buzzed, a harsh electronic sound cutting through the peaceful crackle of the fire. It was Maria, my housekeeper. "Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice hesitant and confused. "I am sorry to disturb you, sir, but there is a woman at the main gate. She is crying, sir. She looks terrible. She says she is family." I didn't answer immediately. I didn't gasp. I didn't smile. I slowly closed my book, marking the page carefully with a leather bookmark. I turned my heavy chair toward the bank of security monitors built into the oak wall. The rain was pouring down heavily, washing over the lens of the front gate camera, distorting the image with streaks of gray water. But I could clearly see her face. Eleanor. 8 years had passed, but it looked like 20. The aristocratic arrogance that once defined her sharp features was completely, utterly gone. Her expensive designer hair was drenched, plastered to her skull like a wet rat. Her beige coat, which I knew cost $4,000, was ruined by the mud splashing from the highway. She was standing in the pouring rain, frantically pressing the buzzer over and over again, looking back over her shoulder down the empty road as if the debt collectors were literally chasing her. I didn't press the intercom button. I just watched her. I watched the freezing rain beat down on the woman who told me I was not good enough. I watched her shiver violently. I watched her panic. I watched her wipe mascara and rainwater from her face. Most people, in my position, would feel a massive rush of vindicating adrenaline. They would feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to laugh, to mock her through the speaker, to remind her of that day in the hospital. They would want to scream, "Look at you now. Look at what you've become." But I felt nothing. No joy. No anger. Just the cold, mechanical realization that the chess game was entering its final, inescapable phase. The trap had sprung. I leaned forward and pressed the communication button. "Yes," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion. "Arthur?" Her voice cracked violently through the speaker. It was trembling, breathless, desperate, barely audible over the roaring thunder. "Arthur, oh my God, it's Eleanor. Please, you have to open the gate. Please, Arthur, it's an emergency. We have nowhere else to go. Please." I let silence hang on the line for a full 20 seconds. I let her listen to the rain. I let her feel the agonizing, terrifying weight of my indifference. I let her wonder if I was going to turn off the intercom and leave her in the mud. Then I reached out and pressed the button to unlock the massive iron gates. I watched on the monitor as they slowly swung open. She practically ran up the long, winding driveway toward the main house, her ruined heels sinking into the wet gravel, stumbling twice before she reached the porch. When Maria finally led her into my study, Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks. The room was vast and deeply intimidating. The walls were lined with thousands of rare books. Original, museum-quality oil paintings hung above the roaring fireplace. I was sitting behind a massive, custom-built oak desk, wearing a tailored three-piece suit. I was no longer the dirty-booted old man she remembered. I looked like a CEO. I looked like a king sitting in his fortress. The reality of her colossal misjudgment hit her so hard I could physically see her shoulders slump. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab the doorframe to steady herself. She realized in a fraction of a second that she had thrown away the very thing she had spent her entire life chasing. The wealth she had destroyed her family to find had been sitting right in front of her all along, and she had banished it. Arthur, she stuttered, standing frozen by the door. Rainwater was dripping from her ruined coat onto my antique Persian rug, forming a dark puddle. "Sit down, Eleanor," I said, gesturing to the heavy leather chair opposite my desk. I didn't offer her a towel. I didn't offer her tea. I didn't offer her comfort. I spoke to her the way one speaks to a trespassing stranger. She walked forward like a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows and sat. She couldn't meet my eyes. She stared at the polished surface of my desk, her chest heaving as she tried to control her violent sobbing. "David is facing complete bankruptcy," she blurted out, the words tumbling over each other as the tears finally spilled over her cheeks. "The bank is taking everything. Arthur, everything. They gave us the final notice today. We have to be out of the house by next Monday. We have nowhere to go. No one will lend us money. My friends won't even return my calls anymore. They pretend they don't know me." She took a ragged, desperate breath, gripping the armrests of the leather chair until her knuckles turned white. "And Leo is going to be pulled out of his academy. He's a gifted child, Arthur. He's brilliant. Moving him to an underfunded public school mid-semester, it will ruin his records. It will ruin his future. He won't survive it. The other kids will eat him alive." She finally looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, red, and swollen. She was playing the only card she thought she had left. "He is your grandson, Arthur. You have to help us. If not for David, then for Leo. Please, I am begging you. I will get on my knees if I have to." I folded my hands on the desk. I didn't lean in. I didn't raise my voice. I maintained the exact same rigid, calm posture I had when I placed that blue teddy bear on the vinyl chair 8 years ago. 8 years ago, I began, my words slow, precise, and deliberate, each syllable dropping like a heavy stone into a quiet pond. "You looked me in the eye and told me that I was not good enough for him. You told me my mediocrity would rub off on your son. You made it abundantly clear, Eleanor, that I had absolutely no place in your family. I was wrong," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "I was stupid. I was arrogant and blind, and I am so sorry, Arthur. I was out of my mind. I'll do anything. Please, we just need $200,000 to clear the immediate arrears, save the house from foreclosure, and pay the school tuition for the year. Just a loan. I swear to God we will pay you back. I'll get a job. David will find work. I'll do anything you want." I watched her cry. I let the silence stretch in the room. I let the crackle of the fire be the only sound for a long, agonizing minute. I let her feel the absolute, suffocating weight of the power dynamic shifting entirely, permanently into my hands. "I am not going to give you $200,000, Eleanor," I said quietly. Her head snapped up. Pure, unadulterated panic flashed in her eyes. The mask of sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by the cornered, dangerous desperation of a trapped animal. "But you have it," she cried out, her voice pitching higher, gesturing wildly at the room. "Look at this place. Look at the art. You're sitting in a mansion. You can't just let your own blood be thrown out onto the street. You can't let your grandson become homeless." "I said I won't give you the money," I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave, freezing her in place. I opened a drawer in my desk and pulled out a thick file folder. Mr. Pruitt had prepared it months ago, anticipating this exact scenario. I slid it across the smooth oak surface toward her. "I am going to pay the private academy directly," I stated, locking my cold eyes onto hers. "The tuition will be fully covered. In advance, until the day Leo graduates high school. I have also instructed my wealth managers to set up an irrevocable trust fund that will cover his college education in its entirety. The money will never at any point touch your hands." She stared at me, her breathing shallow, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Furthermore," I continued, tapping my index finger slowly on the file folder, "the bank will receive a direct wire transfer from my attorneys tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The amount will completely clear the mortgage on your house. All debts, liens, and arrears on the property will be permanently erased." A wave of massive physical relief washed over her face. She closed her eyes and let out a breathless, hysterical laugh. "Oh, Arthur, thank you. Oh my God, thank you. Do not interrupt me," I said. Her eyes snapped open. The smile died on her lips instantly. "The mortgage will be cleared," I repeated coldly. "However, as part of the payoff agreement I have already negotiated with your bank's senior executives, the deed to the property will be transferred entirely into my name." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. Her brain was struggling to process the legal implications of my words. "You will live in my house," I continued, my tone absolute, leaving zero room for negotiation. "You will not pay rent. You will not pay property taxes. I will cover the utilities. But you will also not own a single brick, nail, or floorboard of that structure. You will be tenants. My tenants." I leaned forward just a fraction of an inch, making sure she felt the crushing gravity of the final condition. "And every Sunday afternoon, at precisely 1 o'clock, a car will arrive at that house. It will pick up Leo. It will bring him here, to my estate. He will spend the entire day with me, because it seems, Eleanor, that I am, in fact, good enough for him now." She sat completely frozen in the leather chair. The realization washed over her like ice water. She had driven through a storm, swallowed her massive inflated pride, and come here expecting a simple financial bailout. She thought she could manipulate the estranged, lonely grandfather into writing a check, allowing her to return to her life of illusion and control. Instead, she had just handed me complete, unchecked control of her entire existence. If she said no, she would be homeless on Monday, sleeping in a shelter. If she said yes, she would spend the rest of her life living under my shadow, in my house, entirely at my mercy. "Do you understand the terms, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She looked down at her shaking hands. The fight was completely gone from her eyes. The arrogance was dead. She was utterly defeated. "Yes, Arthur," she whispered to the floor. The paperwork was finalized in less than 48 hours. My lawyers moved with the surgical, terrifying precision of a military strike. David didn't even read the documents when Mr. Pruitt presented them at their dining room table. My son was too broken by his own failure, too crushed by the collapse of his ego, to care. He just signed the deed over to me without a second glance, effectively signing away his independence and becoming a ward of his own father. Eleanor, however, read every single line. I made sure my attorneys included a specific, non-negotiable, legally binding clause on page 4. Highlighted in bold ink, occupancy of the premises is strictly at the discretion of the legal owner and may be terminated without cause at any time, requiring a 30-day vacate notice. Me. I was the owner. I held the sword over her head, and the thread was very, very thin. The following Sunday, at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a black Lincoln Town car pulled up the long driveway of my estate. The rear door opened, and a small, quiet 8-year-old boy stepped out onto the gravel. Leo. He was wearing a perfectly pressed miniature suit, a stiff white collar, and a silk tie. Eleanor had dressed him like a tiny corporate executive desperately trying to impress me, terrified that if the boy put 1 foot wrong, if he spilled a glass of water, I would invoke the claws and throw them out on the street. I walked out to the driveway to meet him. I didn't wear a tailored suit this time. I wore my old faded flannel sweater and my scuffed dirt-covered gardening boots. "Hello, Leo," I said, offering a warm, gentle smile. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and filled with an unnatural, heavy terror that no 8-year-old should ever carry. "Mother said I have to be on my best behavior, sir," he recited, his little voice trembling, his hands rigidly by his sides. She said if I make a mistake or break anything, you'll throw us out on the street. I promise I won't touch anything." My jaw tightened. A flash of cold, violent anger spiked in my chest. She was using the boy's fear to manage her own anxiety. She was weaponizing his innocence to protect her living situation. She was poisoning his mind against me to maintain whatever scraps of control she had left. I knelt down slowly on the gravel, ignoring the dirt on my knees, so I was completely at his eye level. "Leo," I said gently, looking right into his terrified eyes, "you listen to me very carefully. You are my grandson. You are my blood. You are family. You never have to earn your place here. You never have to be afraid of me, and you will never ever be thrown out on the street. Do you understand?" He blinked, the intense tension slowly draining from his small shoulders. "Yes, sir, good," I smiled. "Now, take off that ridiculous, uncomfortable jacket. Roll up your sleeves. We have tomatoes to pick in the garden, and you can't do that in a suit." The Sundays became our sacred tradition. While Eleanor and David lived a hollow, miserable life in a house they no longer owned, constantly pretending to their few remaining high society friends that everything was fine, Leo was learning the value of reality. I didn't spoil him with mindless video games or expensive, useless toys. I taught him how to work. I taught him how to plant a garden, explaining how patience, care, and dirty hands yield tangible results. When he turned 12, I sat him in my massive study and taught him how to read corporate financial statements. I explained how compound interest works, how real estate holds value during recessions, and how to spot a bad investment disguised as a good one. I told him the story of the 70 acres of dirt. I taught him how to build something permanent from absolutely nothing. Over the years, the transformation in the boy was incredible to watch. He stopped being the anxious, performative, terrified child Eleanor was trying to mold. He grew physically strong from working outdoors. He became intellectually confident, grounded, and intensely observant. He started asking brilliant, complex questions about market trends. He wasn't arrogant like his mother. He was quietly, terrifyingly capable. He became my boy. Years passed. The arrangement held perfectly. I paid the bills, they lived in the house in silent submission, and Leo grew into a remarkable young man. But a narcissist can only pretend to be humbled for so long. Eventually, the mask slips. Eventually, they convince themselves that they are the victims, and they try to reclaim the throne. When Leo turned 16, the silence finally broke. It was Thanksgiving. Against my better judgment, I had allowed David and Eleanor to join Leo and me for dinner at my estate. It was a massive, catered affair. The dining room table was laden with roasted turkey, fine sides, and expensive crystal. Eleanor had a few glasses of very expensive wine, the kind I paid for, poured from a bottle from my private cellar, and the alcohol began to dissolve the fear that had kept her in check for 8 years. Her old arrogance, that familiar, sickening aristocratic sneer, began to seep through the cracks in her polite facade. "Arthur," she said suddenly, setting her crystal wine glass down heavily on the table. She leaned across the massive mahogany dining table, her voice dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that made my stomach turn. Leo is practically a man now. He's doing so well at the academy. He's top of his class. David and I have been thinking, it's been a long time. You've made your point. She smiled, a tight, entitled expression. It's time you transferred the deed of the house back into our names. It's only right. We are a family after all, and David is your son. We've suffered enough. We should have our home back. David froze. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He knew better than to push me. He stared at his plate, absolutely terrified of what his wife had just unleashed. Leo stopped eating. His intelligent eyes darted between me and his mother, analyzing the shifting power dynamic in the room with the cold calculation I had taught him. I didn't react with anger. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pound my fist on the table. I carefully, methodically placed my linen napkin on the table next to my plate. The room went completely, suffocatingly silent. Even the antique grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder, counting down the seconds to her destruction. "Eleanor," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, forcing her to lean in closer to hear her own doom. "You seem to be under a massive, fundamental delusion regarding your position in my life." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking in the quiet room. She tried desperately to maintain her fake, confident smile, but it was cracking under the weight of my stare. "I'm the mother of your grandson, Arthur. I am your daughter-in-law. You are a tenant," I corrected her. The words were ice, coating every single syllable, dropping the temperature in the room. "You are a tenant who pays zero rent, living in a house that I bought with cash, eating food that I subsidized, drinking wine from my cellar, while your son attends a private academy that I funded entirely. You are not family, Eleanor. You are a charity case." Her face turned a sickly, ashen shade of pale. The wine glass trembled violently in her hand, spilling a few drops of dark red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. It looked exactly like blood. "You can't speak to me like that," she hissed, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of humiliation and sudden, resurgent fear. "I can speak to you however I choose," I stated. I stood up slowly from the head of the table. I was a tall man, and the ambient lighting in the room cast my long shadow directly over her, enveloping her in darkness. "Because I own the ground you are currently standing on. I own the roof over your head. And just to be absolutely, perfectly clear about your future," I looked down at her, locking eyes with the woman who had once pushed me away from a hospital bassinet because my boots were dirty. "The deed to that house is already locked in an irrevocable ironclad trust." I let the words hang in the air, letting the legal reality crush her. "When Leo turns 18, I continued, delivering the final fatal blow to her ego, he gains full legal control of the property. The house becomes his. At that exact moment, he can choose to let his parents stay as his guests, or he can instruct Mr. Pruitt to issue a formal 30-day eviction notice." I looked over at Leo. He sat perfectly straight, his face an unreadable mask of calm confidence. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at me. He understood exactly what I had done. I hadn't just secured the property. I had given him the ultimate power over his own abusers. I looked back down at Eleanor. She was hyperventilating slightly, staring at her son as if looking at a stranger. The realization was destroying her from the inside out. "Knowing how tired Leo is of your constant manipulations, Eleanor," I whispered, the silence of the room amplifying every word. "If I were you, I would start packing." She didn't say another word. For the rest of the evening, she didn't speak. She didn't eat. The realization that her fate, her living situation, and her entire future rested entirely in the hands of the son she had tried so desperately to control and weaponize, finally, permanently broke her. She was utterly defeated. After they left, I walked out onto the grand stone balcony of my estate, breathing in the crisp, cold evening air. The stars were bright and sharp over the dark valley. 16 years ago, in a 68-degree hospital room, she pushed me away from my grandson's crib. She told me I wasn't wealthy enough, cultured enough, or good enough for him. She demanded total, absolute control over her family's narrative. She thought she had won a permanent victory against an old man in dirty boots. She demanded everything. She got nothing.